Okay, let's start then. Fewer people. Yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hope you had a good golden week. Relax a little bit, or study a lot. I don't know. So where are we? Everybody has had the chance to get access to the textbook and read up. Yes. Who has found the textbook? Who has been able to read? Please read the textbook up to chapter 15. And next week we'll do, or actually 2 weeks from now. So we left off with a discussion of the high growth era and an explanation, the various explanations as to why this miracle was not just a miracle, it was all sorts of things that were in favor, allowing Japan to grow at such a miraculous rate. But now we look at the politics side of this period between 1955 and about 72. And it makes a very interesting contrast to today, or the recent period in Japan, where we had very weak economy, sluggish growth for the last 20 years compared to the 50s, very different. But also politically, very much more turbulent, much more change, much more protesting, much more civic movements, all kinds of conflicts coming to the fore. Today, maybe after 2009, maybe after 2011, there's been some sign of social conflict coming up onto the streets. Protests against nuclear power, for example, or protests against the change of security laws, security-related laws. But if you look back, and if you compare the overall period, from the 90s to today, compared to the 50s to 70s, it's very, very different in terms of the political dynamics. Much more struggle, much more opposition across society. So it's a strange combination of high growth and prosperity, and also a lot of conflict. I don't know if it's a strange combination. Usually you think if a society is getting wealthier and more affluent, there's much more to share and redistribute. So one wouldn't have these kind of outbreaks of, very, very severe conflict. But in Japan's case, in the 50s, that was the situation. It was, as the textbook calls it, Gordon writes, the problems of affluence, or the dilemmas of affluence, conflicts of affluence. Affluence is wealth. So one can think about, it's a very big theme, question of how economic growth and wealth, how that relates to political stability. And in this case, at least in the beginning of the period, in the 50s, 60s, obviously growth is not enough to ensure social and political stability. And another very important theme comes out in this section of this class. There's a theme called Crisis and Compensation. It's a book that came out in the 80s, and a kind of a very ambitious book to try to explain the dynamics of Japan's post-war. And the idea is that what you get is a periods of stability, and then you have a crisis. Some social group is unhappy. There's some group or some geographic area that feels like is losing out, maybe from pollution or maybe from, change in the trade flows. Anyhow, an unhappy group appears, and then it protests, and then the government finds ways to compensate, to restore stability. And it's a cycle, it's cyclical. And you see this very clearly in the 60s and 70s. And one can think about what enables this sort of dynamic of political crisis resulting in compensation, making sure that people are generally satisfied enough so that society is stabilized. Yeah. So that's the theme. So we're halfway through our textbook and halfway through the first section of this course, which is to do an overview until now of Japan's political economy. So let's get to it. Good. I'll close the door. More people are arriving. I guess we have about 60-70% attendance. Good. So, as the title of this chapter is Political Struggles and Accommodation. So, the same period as last week, 2 weeks ago, but now we're looking at the political side. accommodation means hotel room, but it also means to accommodate. It means to create space and to create some kind of opportunity or to compromise with some other group. So accommodation has two meanings. In this case, of course, it's the meaning of accommodating, compromising, and sharing. Today's lecture, I'll start out by talking about, very roughly, the two opposing camps in the post-war period, the so-called progressives, Kakushin, and Hoshu, the conservatives. It's very rough division. You can divide it, as the textbook shows clearly, even within the progressive camp, so-called left camp, even within the unions, even within the Socialist Party, there are divisions. Okay, what to do in terms of the relationship with management, what to do. Unions were divided, whether they should be more cooperative or whether they should be more hostile and aggressive. Also, the Socialist Party was divided on the left and the right. The left wanted to have a kind of close to almost communist revolution as opposed to the security treaty with the U.S. Want to maintain the peace treaty. They're very doctrinaire. There's very fixed positions, whereas the socialists on the right, they just wanted to reform capitalism, wanted to reform the situation. So there's division within the two camps, also on the right as well. Extreme right wing or more conservatives and more pragmatic conservatives. But the point is, it was divided into two groups, and a lot of issues, from what to do with the Constitution, what to do with the U.S. relationship, what to do with trade, what to do with domestic order, there are clashes. And I'll talk about these different struggles. Not all of them, but some of the major ones that the textbook picked up. About the Constitution, reforming the Constitution. Obviously, it's an issue now in the news again. It's kind of similar, not ironic, but historical parallels today. The Democratic Party of Japan, Min Shinto, said they're going to boycott the commission in which the LDP is going to talk about how to reform the Constitution. Came out in the news this morning or yesterday. Similar kind of dynamics in the 50s. The Socialist Party says we're going to boycott all this discussion led by the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, in terms of what to do with the Constitution. Alliance, key point of conflict in the 60s, and it builds up to this. A lot of things are latched on. It's not just about the alliance, it's about different things related to the US and Japan's position in the world, clashes. One of the biggest protests in Japan happens in the 60s, over this, the 60s. Labor, of course, the problem of what to do in terms of the relationship between workers, management, workers and owners, and how to control the workplace, how much to demand in terms of increase in salaries, how much to demand in terms of control over the workplace, these two things. Lots of conflict. Strikes, major strikes. You never hear of strikes in Japan anymore. It's not like France, where every time you go to France, there's a strike in the railway or the airport. Any reason they have. And especially strikes happen around this time of the year. April, May, June. Why? Why do strikes happen in April, May, and June? I don't have the statistics for it, but that's the image I have of strikes. Why would they happen?
Nice.
Huh?
The weather is nice.
The weather is nice, yes. This is the perfect timing to do a strike in Europe. You don't want to protest in the streets in the rain or in the cold. And then gender issues, which we'll treat as a separate topic, as I keep on saying, later in the class, but there are some major conflicts emerging already, probably, I would say, not resolved at this period, but struggles in terms of achieving gender equality in the workplace and in society in general. And finally, environmental issues, which was a very big concern. As I said last class, very rapid growth, rapid modernization, industrialization creates environmental challenges, which we see in terms of pollution issues, mainly. Also, problems of overcrowding in cities, lack of services and welfare in the city. So environment in the city and also around factories. And this was, of course, a very, very major source of contention. And you can see parallels. Perhaps you can draw parallels with the situation in, say, countries like China or India, where there's a lot of this environmental crisis in terms of air pollution, water pollution, all these things which could lead to a political fallout. In Japan, this problem was quite well resolved or settled quite well to a large extent in this period. So we talk about how these conflicts played out, how they were stabilized. And you can think why in some cases, the opponents or those people protesting, they seem to achieve their goals. In others, they didn't seem to achieve their goals. So we can start thinking who won, who didn't win. It's kind of strange way of describing it, but in terms of struggle, the outcome, who benefited from the outcome of the struggle and why? It's a difficult question. Okay. How to characterize this period? It was economic miracle and considerable political struggle by different groups. These are the questions we can think about. Maybe at the end of the class we can discuss. People are awake enough. Are we people awake? They're awake now. Soon they'll be asleep. What is the relationship between economic growth and conflict? Why do these struggles emerge? How they resolve? Who wins? What does it mean to win a conflict? When and how do winning majority groups accommodate unhappy minorities? This is a very big social science question or political science question. When there's a group, maybe 10%, 20%, I don't know, minority group, who's ferociously opposed to what the majority wants to do or loses out, when does the majority decide to share and when does it decide to compromise? What allows this kind of compromise with minority group? If everybody's in agreement or the majority is in agreement that something is wrong, then if it's a democracy and if it's functioning properly, eventually the majority opinion will carry weight. But in the case of Japan, the opponents were not all in the majority. Or those fighting against constitutional reform might have been not 100% majority. Let's get to the individual cases to explain what I'm trying to say. Okay. So let's start with the two camps. The conservatives in Japanese called Hoshu. One can describe as right, but not. It's kind of these right and left divisions are sometimes a bit unclear. It depends on the cultural context. Essentially, the Liberal Democratic Party. It was founded through the merger of two parties, which will have roots in the pre-war period. The Liberal Party and the Democratic Party, and as the textbook describes, I won't go into detail. The Liberal Party and the Democratic Party they had differences in personality, leadership, and also in terms of policy approach and emphasis. But they eventually merged, mainly because they were worried that the socialists that had merged previously or earlier would take over. So they forced the conservatives to come together to oppose the left that had come together. This takes time, but eventually the conservatives become supported by a very wide range of groups. They're a catch-all party. Catch-alls, and they're not just specifically targeting one group of people. They're not just the farmers' party, or they're not just the business party, or they're not just the urban party. They have a very wide range of support. From big businesses, farmers, small and medium companies and enterprises, retail trade, small shop owners, industrial workers as well. Some unions were in support of them. And of course, the wealthier and more white-collar city dwellers, some of them were supporting the LDP. You had religious groups as well, all sorts of different groups and societies the LDP managed to bring into its fold. And this, of course, is a result of its strategy of crisis and compensation, which I'll explain. And it's one of the very unique parties in the world. As I already said, I think earlier in the class, that it dominated post-war Japanese politics. If you want to understand Japanese post-war politics, you have to understand LDP and why it was so successful. From 1955, when it was founded, and it won the election that year, majority, it kept staying in power in the lower house. Sometimes it loses the upper house control, very rarely, but the lower house, Shugin, which is the most important, control, except for 11 months in 1993, and from 2009 to 2012. And it's back in power still. Are there any other countries in the world where one party continues to win although they're democratic elections for a very long period. Does anybody know an example of a one-party dominant system? China? China is definitely one-party dominant. Well, how is China different from Japan? Mainland China, right?
But it's not democratic.
Yeah, they don't have free and fair elections between opposing parties. So that's a bit different. How about in yes?
South Korea?
South Korea? Has it been one party in power all the time?
Well, there was that one party that was in power for like a very long period of time, but the elections just happened to change.
Right. Well, I guess what party would that be? The military regime after the Cold War period. I'm not sure it would be called fully democratic. It became fully democratic in about mid-80s. The elections became free and fair. So I'm talking countries that have had free and fair elections with one party in control for a very long time. It's quite rare. Example would be Sweden, for example. Between the 30s to the 1970s, we had, relatively free and fair elections, but one party, the Socialist Workers' Party, Labour Party, continued winning for 40 years, basically. So you have situations like that, but I think it's rare, and Japan is often raised as a key example. How is it possible? Why is this party so successful? And most of the observers say, well, the elections, of course, it's designed to favor the incumbent party, but still, it's remarkable how they did it, and people want to learn. How is it possible to win elections over and over? Because it's not as if they were not threatened or challenged. They were threatened and challenged, okay? So, the picture of the LDP coming together in 1955. It's the formation of the party. Okay, and on the other side, on the left, are the progressives, so-called. On the left, one can group these different parties. The Socialist Party, which was also founded in 1955, they had split once to the Socialist left and the Socialist right, but they had emerged. Then the Communist Party, which is the oldest party in Japan, existing, long-lived party, which was legalized in 1945, and we talked about the purge in 1950, the crackdown, and a lot of the people who were working in the government or in businesses, if they had ties to the Communist Party or Communist members, they're kicked out, they're fired, which was what the purge was. But even still, they continued, and they were, although they're legal, and they've continued to this day. And then you have the Democratic Socialist Party, which broke off from the Socialist Party. Those were more on the right side, more conservative or more moderate. Who supported the left? Well, workers, union members in the public sector, the private sector. So public sector had unions, private sector had unions. Farmers that did not have, which had ties to the tenant movement from the pre-war period. Some farmers, not all, majority were in favor of the LDP and conservatives, but some farmers. Urban people who had low status, who were not necessarily white collar. A lot of the educated university professors and teachers, especially, were very much supporting the socialists and even the communists. And women, educated women, housewives, tended to, if they were not part of in the rural areas, the urban, they would support one of these left parties, including a new party which emerged in the mid-60s called Komeito, which is had strong religious backing from religious organizations. Okay, and the left it's important to note that they were divided, unlike the right. The conservatives in Japan maintained a united front. They didn't break up. Sometimes a number of politicians would leave the LDP and make a small fringe party, but they would eventually come back into the fold. Especially between 55 and 72, the right were united, but the left was divided. They kept on breaking up and infighting, so this made them weak. And for a very long time, they were unable to form or join government. They were so-called the Mannen Yato. Mannen means 10,000 years, and Yato means opposition. So they're in opposition, not 10,000 years, but, well, 40 years, 38 years, which is a long time. And their support in elections tended to be maybe half the support of the LDP. They could never get the number of seats and the number of votes equaling LDP, so it was called a 1.5 party system. You can see this in this graph. This is the number of votes that each of the parties, the LDP and the Socialist Party, eventually the Democratic Party, received from the 50s to about the 70s. Clearly, LDP had about 60 to 50, 40, 50%, whereas the main opposition party, they had 25, 20, 15 even sometimes. So 1.5. If it was a competitive two-party system, that is, if the two parties that compete effectively, you would have close to 40%, 30% both parties. Or more, I guess. If it's just two parties, then there would be 50, 40, 60, 60, 40, depending on the election. And you have a change of government, right? The Labor government, and then the Conservative government, or the Democrats and the Republicans. But you didn't see this, and that will be continuing to it. Well, this is not important. Okay, so why? Why is the LDP so strong? And the book doesn't go into such careful analysis or sort of systematic analysis. Well, let's do that a little bit here. I would point out to a number of things. First, one has to talk about the environment. And there's a very good environment to be a political party in government. That is, you had very strong economic growth, 10%, 8% every year. So people cannot blame the government for bad economic performance, right? Oftentimes they say that governments lose elections because economic performance is bad or unemployment rates are high. But during this period, unemployment is very low, income is going up, everybody's being able to buy more TVs and cars and air conditioners and refrigerators and what have you. So people are generally satisfied economically. Not everybody, but most. And the government managed to find a way of redistributing wealth throughout the country among different groups. Because although Japan's economy was growing very quickly, it wasn't all sectors that were growing equally. Primarily, it was the industry and it was exporters, right? That was making money, that was being profitable and competitive. These new industries like ship, and chemicals and plastics, and eventually cars, electronics. These were the places that were making lots of money. Other places, the farms, small stores, retail stores, service area was not as profitable or as competitive. So what the LDP did was to share that wealth between these two groups. Urban areas, factory areas, redistributed to the hinterland, to the rural areas. And this was a very important dynamic global economy of share and redistribution. And we talk a little bit about this coalition of steel and rice, construction state. These are two phrases used to describe Japan. A coalition, rengo, of steel and rice. What could steel and rice be? Somebody give me a guess. What does steel represent? It was a kind of symbol of some group.
Farmers.
Farms?
Farmers. No.
Rice is farmers.
Yes.
What about steel?
Like production
Production like what?
of heavy.
Somebody have something to say? No? Steel? Heavy industry?
Yeah.
Heavy industry, exporters, all these industries that use steel. Car makers, electronics. Okay? And there was a coalition between the two. And the LDP put it together, and by putting it together, it managed to stay in power. Construction state is another expression. I'll show you some statistics of how much money was spent to build bridges and dams and roads across Japan. Why? Because this was a way to spread wealth into the rural areas and create jobs and keep people happy. There's also very strong ties between the businesses, large business interests, and the LDP and bureaucrats, and what is called the Iron Triangle. And it was possible because of stability, political power remain in one hand, so these ties could become deepened and deepened and deepened, benefiting all three groups. The left, of course, why LDP is strong? Well, you have to explain why the opposition was weak. Without explaining the opposition, can't really explain why the government is winning all the time. We'll look at that a little bit. And then some institutional factors, some rules of the game, which benefited the ruling party. This is more political science, but oftentimes they say the electoral system, the electoral rules benefited the LDP. And also the fact that Japan was highly centralized, fiscally centralized. All the money and tax money in Japan generated was sucked into the central government, and the central government decided where to spread the money around. Central government controlled by LDP. If you want to have money in your town or village, you have to vote for LDP, otherwise you won't get a bridge or dam or whatever benefit you're looking for. That's the logic. Okay, well let's look at the different factors, starting with this coalition of rice and steel. This was, as I say, it was an exchange between urban manufacturers and rural voters, essentially. Urban manufacturers, meaning industry, that uses steel or exports in general, and rural voters as represented by farmers and farming. The export manufacturers, ship makers, electronic makers, for example, they were profitable and they're competitive. And what they do is they provide donations to the party, the LDP. They also generate tax revenue. They pay a lot of taxes. And from this, they get, what do they get? They get protection from the government in terms of closing the Japanese market from imports, competitive imports, so the local market was protected. You didn't have foreign cars or foreign ships or foreign, steel makers come into Japan or construction companies, because there was a lot of regulation and barriers. And also to control prices and control so that competition within the country didn't become too excessive, to protect the big industries or big companies already operating in Japan. What was this money used for? Well, the political donations used to win elections. Elections were very expensive in this period for various reasons. But also the tax revenue, what do they use? They used to fund public works and transfers to unprofitable other industries, mainly agriculture and construction, and retail stores and whatnot. You have other smaller groups, which were mainly concentrated in the rural areas. And what did the rural areas give in return? Well, construction companies, farmers, they donated some political donations to the LDP, but that was not the main benefit that they gave in return. They gave votes. Okay? Rural areas had lots of votes and lots of parliamentarians. So that was the exchange. And this resulted in what was called construction state of Japan. You have a lot of districts, that is electoral areas, outside of urban areas, with few industries, but lots of diet members. This is what is called, in English. It was disproportional. There were many more people living in urban areas, and more people left the rural areas to live in the city. But they didn't change the distribution of politicians, the number of politicians that represent each of the areas. So you get this Ikkyo no Kakusa. So you have more politicians coming from rural areas. So it's very, very important if you're in government, if you're a party in government, you want to win election, you need to win rural areas. And what do? You provide, you create business, you create jobs, you spend money in rural areas. How do they spend it? You spend it by promising public works. What are public works? Well, there are these kind of things: dams, bridges, rivers, ocean wall fortification, nochi kaitaku, or improving agricultural land, making airports, harbors, bullet train stations, very important. If, as a politician, you're in a rural area, you promise, I'll bring this big harbor to your town, or I'll create a new station, or I'll build a bridge over the river, or a new tunnel to connect the streets. The people are happy because it's infrastructure and it makes their life easier to travel, transport, or whatever. But more than that, it creates jobs. Major construction back then required lots of people, and it created jobs. So this was very, very important dynamic. Local voters, many of them who work in either agriculture or construction, more and more rural workers' population were not just dependent on agriculture for their income. Why? Because you don't need so many people working in agriculture. You have mechanization, and also in terms of the money you can make from selling agricultural products is much less. When as an economy grows and becomes more developed, the value added of agricultural products is less. So you cannot make as much money as selling cars or electronics. So what you need to do, you need to find other jobs, and mainly the government supply jobs for construction. Okay. So if an LDB candidate who promises these things wins, then it pressures the central government, which controls where these projects are to be done, because it's a centralized system. And then it brings whatever, a dam or road or airport. And the politician says, look, you voted for me and I brought this back for you. Aren't you happy? And they'll be happy, and then it will repeat itself. And it'll happen all across Japan. In all these districts. In rural areas, primarily, all the politicians would win elections. Conservatives will focus on attracting goodies, attracting public works, so-called pork barrels, to their own electoral district. And this worked very well because Japan's economy was growing, exporters were successful, there was a lot of tax revenue, so the government had relatively a lot of extra money to spend, not like today. And it also redistributed the wealth to rural areas so that there was stability in rural areas. And what you have, if you have all these public works all over Japan, you have these what is called the bridges and roads to nowhere. Was a way of describing a situation in which you have all these roads and bridges which are not necessarily economically practical or necessary or the most efficient. So you'll have a superhighway in the middle of in the forest or in the middle of the mountains, and the only cars that use, very few cars use it. It's more bears or I don't know, raccoons. Kanuki uses these roads. Or you have one national highway and then a local highway and then a prefectural road and 3 roads going to the same place. Very fancy dams that, dubious necessity. I'm not saying that all this infrastructure was not necessary. Most of it was required, but a lot of it went beyond rational, needs. It was politically rational, but it was not economically rational. And you can see this. This is how much money the Japanese government spends on capital investments, so public works primarily, as opposed to other countries. Black is Japan. The other countries, and Japan has spent 5-6% of its GDP on construction. Whereas a country like the US spends only 2.5%. Germany even less. So, of course, Japan had to catch up because a lot of its infrastructure was destroyed at the end of the war. But even still, a very high level of capital investments. And there's a lot of crazy statistics, like the amount of concrete per person, per capita, that Japan spent was 10 times more than per capita in the US. All kinds of crazy statistics. So it's not just roads. You have such a thing as tetrapods. Have you ever seen this before in the ocean? It's only in Japan. I don't think I've seen it elsewhere. Has anybody seen this outside of Japan? The idea is supposed to stop the wave from taking away sand and eroding the beach. So it's supposed to have a practical purpose, but I've heard studies, scientific studies, saying there isn't much benefit. Actually, makes the situation worse. But all over Japan, coastline, rivers, massive amounts of public works. And what does it do? Well, it creates jobs. You have to plant these tetrapods. So this is just an example. And if you travel around Japan, you'll see a lot of infrastructure. I mean, if you travel in the countryside in the UK or France or Germany, you don't see as much concrete. In Japan, you see a tremendous amount of concrete. Okay? Is that a good thing? Well, it was good in terms of redistributing wealth, but in terms of the beauty of the landscape, I don't know. Okay, well, it was not just public works, it was not just rural areas. LDP became patrons of all types of interest groups, all kinds of groups. Religious organizations, doctors and nurses, postal services, for example, they somehow managed to ensure they listened to the requests of all these groups saying, okay, postal services, you want to have this kind of situation. You don't want to have competition from private postal services. Will protect you, will create regulations and restrictions to make sure that your businesses are functioning the way you want. And in return, please vote for us in block as a group. All your employees, all your family, please vote for us. So it became a very close relationship between certain interest group and the party. All these produced, and I won't go into all the details, but LDP managed to expand and include a lot of groups. But the LDP was not patron, or how should I say, backed by everybody. It didn't need everybody, it just needed a majority. Coalition, electoral coalition that was enough to make it keep winning its elections. And as I showed you in the chart, 2030, they only won 40-50% of the votes. So who are the groups that didn't back the LDP? Well, urban, consumers in general, as opposed to producers, salaried workers, those who work for big companies, they tended not to vote for the LDP because they didn't get as much of the benefits, direct benefits. They didn't see the benefits that you would if you live in the rural areas. Okay? Those with an ideological position opposed to the U.S. security, which we'll talk about in a moment, who wanted to maintain the Constitution, because the LDP, among its different agendas, it wasn't just redistribution of wealth, it was to change the Constitution, it was to have a strong alliance with the U.S. These people on the left were obviously opposed to the LDP. Another group, of course, were those environmentalists, or I don't know if you would call them environmentalists back then, but those who are opposed to unrestricted development and modernization, destroying dams, destroying mountains by construction. Okay? There are some of these anti-developmental attitudes increasingly in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Some others who had more modern or liberal family values, they would have opposed LDP, and women who felt like they were not equally listened to, because the LDP tends to be dominated by men, very few female LDP politicians, and a lot of their policies were directed towards a very traditional family structure, with the man going out to make money as a breadwinner, and the woman staying home as a housewife. If you agreed with that, that's fine. But if you're educated, you felt like you want more opportunity, you'd be opposed to this, because it's very conservative. Same for these groups. And if you think about them, this will of course lead to struggle. Although some of them were not in the majority, or electoral majority, they opposed and resisted. And this of course leads to conflict. Okay, so we'll talk about the different conflicts now. Up to this point, do you have any questions? It was a rather broad discussion, but basically the idea is two opposing camps, and the conservatives were very successful in getting support from a lot of groups, not all groups. And they did this, particularly support in rural areas, through spreading wealth by providing construction jobs, and also protecting farmers through tariffs and regulations in terms of imports of agricultural products. I didn't actually mention here, I should have. Okay. Let's go then to the constitutional conflict. What was this about? Well, the LDP was founded originally to reform the Constitution. That's their founding goal. Right? The reason why the party was founded was to put an end to or change the post-war Constitution, which they saw, many saw in the LDP as being forced upon them by the Americans, and taking away the autonomy of Japan, the independence of Japan. And it was necessary to change that, especially Article 9, because without a military, you're not a real the argument was, if you don't have your own military, then you can't protect yourself. You don't have sovereignty, you can't protect your sovereignty, so you're not really a real nation. So there were those who wanted to change the Constitution. On the other side, of course, were the progressives. who sought to defend the Constitution. Okay, those on the left, they wanted to maintain Article 9 because they didn't want to go back to a situation where Japan could wage war. They did not want to have they did not want pre-war Japan to return, and they felt Article 9 was the best way to prevent this from happening. Okay, and it was a bit ironical because all of those on the left, they're very critical of the United States. They're critical of the U.S. in the Korean War. They're critical of the U.S. position in the Cold War generally, Vietnam War especially. The U.S. is aggressive, imperial, colonial power, invading other countries. But at the same time, they wanted to protect the Constitution, which the United States provided them. So it's a kind of they love Article 9, they love the Constitution, which the Americans gave them, but they don't like the Americans. So kind of irony. And in the conflicts that arose, as I said already, the LDP will try to push for reform, but the JSP will resist and they'll boycott. And eventually, the enthusiasm within the LDP to reform the Constitution lessened. Why? Well, it was very, very difficult to change the Constitution in Japan. Article 96 of the Constitution says you need to have what? 2/3 majority of the upper house and lower house. And what else do you need? Yeah, 国民投票, which is a plebiscite. You have to have the people vote for it. This is a very, very high hurdle compared to other countries. So they never really had 2/3 majority in both houses. And there are those within the LDP who felt it's too much trouble to change the Constitution. And there is not enough popular support. Okay? So they became pragmatic. They said, well, we don't really like it, but business is good and it's stable and we don't want to rock the boat. So let's put it aside for another moment. And that's basically how it's been until today. Even today, there are those within the LDP who are more pragmatic, saying it's very difficult to change. So the Constitution has never been changed in Japan because of this high hurdle, lack of popular support, and also pragmatism among the politicians who feel like if we do this, we may lose the next election, so we don't need to do this. Well, Abe-san has another idea. Well, in 2006, he came to power pushing for constitutional reform, and that he backed down. 2012 too. He has come down the radar and is focusing much more on the economy. He's trying to push it back on the agenda, but we'll see what happens. An issue that became much more clear, open conflict was that involving the U.S. security treaty and the relationship with the U.S. and the situation of U.S. bases and military in Japan, and also nuclear weapons, possibility of having nuclear weapons, U.S. weapons in Japan. This became a very, very sharp point of conflict. Essentially, the conservatives wanted to continue the treaty, but they wanted to revise it to make sure that U.S. and Japan were equal. The first security treaty signed in 1952-51 was not equal. U.S. did not have obligations necessary to Japan, defend Japan, and there was no deadline, so they wanted to change that. So they wanted to continue it, but they wanted to strengthen the alliance, and they also wanted to improve the position of Japan. The progressives, those on the left, were basically opposed to the treaty altogether. They wanted to not have a specific military alliance with a particular country. Why? Well, they're pacifists. They believe it's not necessary to have military relationship. You can maintain peace through negotiation and multilateral ties, foreign aid, these kind of things. How realistic that is, I don't know. But they're also afraid of entrapment. There's a big theme in Japanese IR, a lot of IR. It's a question of entrapment as opposed to abandonment. Entrap, abandon. What does it mean to be entrapped? What's a trap? Mana, right? You get snared, you get caught. So if you have an alliance, if you're a smaller country and you have alliance with a big country, The big country goes to war, you can't stop it, and you're trapped. You have to fight with it. So you get sucked into something you don't want. What about abandonment? It's the opposite. If you're a small country, the bigger country in the alliance will say, no, we don't want to defend you. Oh yeah, the troops have invaded your island, small island off the South China Sea. We can't fight for you. That's abandonment. So there's always this risk in an alliance, US-Japan. Entrapment or abandonment? Those on the left are very much afraid of entrapment. I think those on the right were afraid of abandonment, the extreme right. So they say we can't depend on the US, we need to have our own. So, and there was also, over the treaty, and also the contents of the treaty, or the results of the treaty, was that the US would have lots of bases in Japan, primarily in Okinawa, but not just Okinawa. In the beginning, in the post-war period, there are bases all across Japan, and Kanagawa, and I don't know, outside Osaka, all these places. So they don't want, there are those who are opposed to these troops' presence. Why? Because a lot of these US military troops committed crimes, not a lot, but there are a lot of crimes. Traffic accidents, hit and run accidents, I don't know. Fights between the troops and the locals. Anyhow, personnel-related crimes, crimes against women as well. So local residents they didn't want this situation, obviously. So there's a lot of protests. It's called peace movement protests. Also, there was a question about nuclear weapons, and of course, Japan, as a victim of 2 nuclear bombs, there was a lot of sentiment against it. And the fact that the US was developing more and more nuclear bombs and had signs that the US were bringing nuclear weapons into US military bases in Japan. It was forbidden, and it was essentially, the agreement was the US will not bring in nuclear weapons, but there was secret deals done which showed that the US had brought nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines to various parts, primarily in Okinawa. And this caused an uproar, particularly after the Lucky Dragon incident, Furyumaru, where the Americans were testing a nuclear bomb in the Pacific Islands, Bikini Atoll, and a Japanese fishing boat was exposed and they got radiated, and a number of the fishermen, I think, died from radiation. And this, of course, increased the tension on nuclear weapons and fired up a movement, opposition towards US nuclear weapons. So, and of course, Vietnam War, starting in late 50s, 60s, a lot of hostility towards US action there, and a lot of the US troops in Vietnam, they go from Okinawa, they're based in Japan, so there was this protest. So all these things heightened conflict between progressives and those pacifists and conservatives who are defending the US military security alliance, which permitted these things. This, of course, comes to a head, that is, reach a climax in late 50s, 1960, when Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke, which is the grandfather of Prime Minister Abe, finally manages to make a revision and agree with a revised security treaty, which, if you look at the contents, is much more advantageous for Japan in detail. But the public become very, very angry, especially the left, because it's seen as being forced. It's forced through the Diet by LDP majority. The opposition parties pushed aside because they have majority. And in May 1917, which is next week, you have massive protests. One of the biggest protests in Japan, I would say, about 100 to 200,000 protesters are on the diet. Even one young protester was killed, unfortunately, a Todai student. And US officials, diplomats who are coming to Japan to prepare for the president's visit. Eisenhower is going to visit Japan later on in that year. The envoy, the diplomat, he gets surrounded. His car gets surrounded on the way from, it was Narita. No, it was Haneda, must be Haneda. Haneda to the Tokyo Center. and had to be rescued. So very unstable. You can't even imagine a situation like this in Japan today, where a U.S. diplomat gets surrounded by protesters and has to be rescued by a helicopter. It actually happened in 1960. Eisenhower cancels visit. The treaty takes effect because although the protests were going on, the lower house had passed the bill, and it was supposed to be signed by the upper house. The upper house didn't do anything, so the bill passes naturally. If a bill is not approved or rejected by the upper house, after a certain amount of time, it becomes law. Okay? Tishi resigns to take responsibility, and then the protesters disperse. You can see this some pictures here. This is when they pass through the legislation in the lower house. These are opposition people, I guess, trying to block it, and then the government officials are trying to pass through to get to the speaker. This is Hagerty being surrounded by the protesters, the U.S. official. I guess this is FBI or CIA or Secret Service protecting the diplomat from protesters. Is break down lower house. This is a union, right? Jiro Shibuya, so some kind of union. Who are these protesters? Well, a lot of students, a lot of union workers, a lot of pacifists, communists, Socialist Party supporters, all over religious organizations. Marines come to rescue him. Amazing in Japan. From Haneda to the U.S. Embassy. Another picture, very famous, of the day of the protests. Massive amounts. Of course, we've seen pictures of protests against the nuclear power, restarting nuclear power plants. So, a lot of comparisons made. I think the numbers are much, I don't know, I should check, but nothing comparable to this. So it's very widespread movement. But it dissipates, and it's seen as a kind of ultimate loss because the treaty is passed. But the protesters, they move on to another issue. Well, a lot of these groups, the unions, the socialists, the students, they have another issue to fight, and that's related to industrial relations. There's another point of conflict, which was between workers and management, and this was growing tensions related to labor relations. Okay, and in 1960, we'll get to it, but before this, there had been already growing tensions between unions seeking higher wages and greater control of workflow, floor work safety regulations. I don't know, number of overtime, how to distribute work. They're struggling and oftentimes succeeding in having control over that. A lot of these more militant unions, steel shipbuilding, transport, coal mines, they were united under Sokyo. They pursued workplace struggle, for wage increases. Of course, there were those within the unions who felt that it was much better to be more cooperative management, not just fight, not just demand, that you could achieve much more by being more cooperative. And so the unions were split. Sokyo, which was linked to the Socialist Party, Dome, which was another more right-leaning union, which was supported by the DSP, the Socialist Party. Eventually, the cooperative union side won out. But before that, you had major strikes. One of them, which the book talks about in detail, is the one called the Mike mine strike. Okay? Mike mine was one of the major coal mines in Japan, southern Japan. And what happened was, well, there was less need for coal in Japan because oil was cheap and oil flows were coming into the country. Mitsui, one of these conglomerates that owned the mine, were going to rationalize, were going to fire a number of workers because they didn't need as many. They were going to shut down eventually production or reduce production because coal was not as profitable back then. There was a 10-month strike, very long strike, by 10 to 20,000 supporters. Government sent in lots of troops, and you can see some of these struggles here. It's not just the workers, the housewives supporting or wives supporting, and also from all over Japan. It wasn't just the directly affected employees of the mine, but it was also student groups and other union workers. They came, and they all collected, and this became a focal point of struggle. But finally, of course, the strike broke, and the company was able to fire the miners with some compensation. So this was also another loss, I could say, on the side of the protesters. And well, there are other strikes, movements, but overall, the very radical, very militant private sector strikes diminished after this and dispersed. There was public sector and railway unions and whatnot tended to continue on, but they did not have as much support or attention as this nationwide strike came. This was also 1960. So there are two major strikes or protests: one against the security treaty and the other against coal mine closing. Okay, or coal mine being reduced. Another point to mention is, alongside these workers struggling or pacifists struggling, there were women struggling and in conflict. Although, of course, the women were also engaged in these major industrial strikes, but they were in their own workplace. They were struggling to ensure quality of treatment. And a lot of it had to do with what we spoke about 2 weeks ago, the fact that women did not have equal opportunity to pursue a long-term career, to be on the career track. They were working in more lowly jimu, so administrative work. They could not go up the career ladder and get management level. Very few managers, female managers back then. And another issue, of course, is companies, when the women they hired got married or got pregnant, they would encourage or push them to quit. Oftentimes they would quit on their own. And so this was seen as clear sabet, that is unfair treatment of women. And there are a number of major strikes. One of them in the book talked about is this Omi Silk Company, the 1,500 women strike. And they win the right to continue working after marriage. Their union, which was not recognized, is recognized. Dormitory rules. Apparently they had to live in a dormitory, the women workers, and had to stay there until they had to come home by 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. All kinds of rules about their personal life. They fought against it and they won. Across Japan, especially in urban areas, nurses and hospital workers, oftentimes women, mainly female profession, unionized, and they fought and they achieved similar rights. So the statistic in the book was before the mid-1960s, the number of married nurses were very little, very few, 2-3%. But after that, a majority of them were married nurses and hospital workers. So it was possible to continue working. So they managed to succeed, perhaps more effectively than the coal miners, probably because coal mines were going out of fashion. You need to have hospital workers and nurses. You have to keep them happy. Economic realities. There are some other major cases, Sumitomo Cement trial, discrimination for white-collar workers. So this is more like service, and this is more secondary. But this is a major company, and not white-collar workers, women were fighting back. And they managed to win the right to continue working after pregnancy, or make sure that the company didn't discriminate, even if they got married and had children. Okay, so there was this struggle going on, and to a large degree, there was progress and there was a success by women protesters, but it was not. Well, we need to go into more detail, but it was not fully satisfactory. It wasn't overnight that the women's condition in the workplace became equal, and even today we have this problem. Okay, environment. This is often discussed. I think even in your high school textbooks, I'm sure you're definitely a student, you'd have come across this. The 1960s, 50s, late 50s, 60s, 70s was a period of a lot of environmental problems. Primarily from factory effluents, factory pollution. Okay, the famous ones, Yotsukai Ichizensoku, Minamata Byo, Itai Byo, Niigata Minamata Byo. These are cadmium and mercury poisoning. Terrible, terrible kinds of suffering by people who ate the fish that had drank the water which was poisoned by mercury, and the children that are born from this kind of situation, they're polluted, so they get deformed or they get asthma, all kinds of problems. And the local residents protested with the help of outside interests, media, scientists, and also student groups, women's groups, environmental groups, circles. They all kind of rallied together to support the victims of this poisoning of this pollution. Local groups of pollution victims created nationwide networks, so they linked across the nation so quite successfully. The student groups, unions, feminists, they all came together on this issue. A similar issue, which I should say they were successful in 1964, was it? The companies involved had to pay compensation. The court ruled saying that these pollution victims need to be compensated. Okay, so it was settled in favor of the victims. A similar kind of national network of support for local victims occurred in the Narita airport struggle. Narita airport, which is one of my least favorite airports because it's so far away from everything. Actually, Kanku is even worse, but if you live in Kyoto. When they built Narita airport, there were farmers there on the land that they were built. And most of the farmers were compensated and left, but a few families stayed on and resisted, arguing that the government was not very clear. They were sort of tricked into selling their land, or they were being forced, so they held on, and even selling small parcels of land to the supporters of these farmers. So you have 1 square meter, or very small plots of land owned by hundreds of different people. So there are lots of landowners which the airport authorities and the government had to deal with. It unites farmers and students to prevent this site from being developed. It took a very long time until this was eventually realized. So not just Narita Airport, but all kinds of localized protests to building and development, pollution, was created national networks. It wasn't just the locals fighting against it. It created national links. And this was relatively successful, one would say. Some areas, of course, like dams, there was a lot of local opposition to dams. Sometimes they failed. So it's interesting to do a study of why some areas, some local protests were successful, others weren't. But many were. Okay. They sit in, boycott, shareholder meeting, destruction, losses will consider all kinds of strategies to fight against development. Oh, sorry, it was 1970 or 1973 for the Big Four pollution. This is 64, right? Okay, and they won compensation from the big companies. Another important development from this is that local governments became much more active in regulating against environmental pollution. Why? Well, it's the local government that the locals who are unhappy go to first. They go to the mayor or the governor and they complain. And local governments, maybe they didn't have the power, formal authority to do so, but they would introduce local regulations, local restrictions to make it difficult for factories to produce pollution, or stricter regulations, more stricter than the national standards. In the beginning, the national government was very unhappy, and they tried to stop local governments from doing this. But the local governments had a level of support and autonomy, and this spread across Japan. One city or one prefecture puts in a regulation over factory activity or pollution, then another city or another prefecture does the same. It's copied. Eventually, it spreads across Japan, and then the central government decides, okay, well, let's make it a national law. So environmental standards are being created at the local level. It was being kind of the policy innovation that goes on, which is quite interesting because we tend to think of local governments in Japan as relatively powerless. But in this period, local governments were quite powerful because they had strong support from local citizens. And this issue was such a clear majority of people in the areas affected were against pollution, obviously. Few people will say yes for pollution, if you live right next to it. Well, maybe there's another slide later, but I'll talk about the fact that a lot of governors and mayors from these areas, from the backing of these groups, were not LDP. I said that the LDP is winning all the time. They're dominant. Nationally, yes. But locally, in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of socialist and even communist-supported governors and mayors. In Japan, it's called Kakushinchi Jidai, and this is a very important dynamic of creating representation outside of the national level that changes, that makes the crisis become compensation. Okay, so that's that for the actual struggles. Maybe there are too many cases, it might be a bit confusing, but just to give you a flavor of what was going on at that time. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Well, let's just look at the overall dynamic of how these conflicts seem to be stabilized. So basically explain in most of the individual cases, but overall. At the peak, after the end of this 1960s crisis, the security crisis, with all these people on the streets, and then this Todai dies in protest, and then they had to, Kishi resigns, the prime minister resigns to take responsibility for the chaos. The new prime minister comes in, his name is Ikeda Hayato, and he has a completely new track. His focus is not on foreign policy, it's not on relation with the US, on revising the constitution, these big things. His focus is basically, let's grow the economy, let's keep everybody happy. And he comes up with this Shotoku Baiboku, which is doubling your income in 10 years' time. His promise was to double the national GDP and personal income, rapid growth and conditions of full employment. This was his main argument. Don't worry about the foreign relations, don't worry about US security, don't worry about the constitution, we'll just focus on economy. So he de-ideologizes the situation. There's so much ideology, pacifist ideology, conservative ideology, focus on, Japan's independence or statehood. These were very divisive things. But if you talk about economic growth, most people, the majority, except for those who are anti-development, would agree doubling of the economy is a great thing. He also takes a much more compromised position towards the labor unions. Unlike his previous LDP governments, the LDP does a lot of things to try and pull up to get the labor unions on their side. And in the book, Andrew Gordon is originally a labor union scholar, labor relations scholar. He explains the process by which the LDP gets the very militant unions on their side. There also support to the rural areas is stepped up. Although there wasn't so much opposition from rural areas per se. But for example, shutting down coal mines in Miike and southern Kyushu. So lots of jobs are lost. Kyushu and Hokkaido, coal mines shut down. What do? They provide a lot of public works to these areas in Kyushu. Build new highways, build new industrial zones. This is compensation. We're sorry we shut down we're sorry we moved away from coal, and we supported this company shutting down its operations, firing all these people. In its place, we'll provide new jobs, construction jobs, public work. In urban areas, which are protesting and unhappy because of this overcrowding and urbanization, much more focused. LDP tended not to be a party of social welfare, but they're starting to talk about social welfare. Social welfare such as old age care, pensions, nurseries, kindergartens, parks in the cities, all these things they start to invest in. Okay? And this is in the 60s. At the same time as this is happening, as I said, local governments are responding to these challenges, and local voters are voting in all these non-LDP, socialist, communist party, communist-supported governors, period of progressive local governors. Kyoto, for example, has been long held by a non-LDP, was held by a non-LDP mayor, governor, Turazo and Nobetatsukiji in Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, all these places, major cities, Kyushu, Yokohama, they had all these non-LDP, non-conservative governors and mayors. They become a very important pressure on the central government to provide more compensation. You have to deal with the situation, otherwise we're going to lose the next election. Look, all the big cities are being controlled by opposition groups. So this made the LDP sit up. So there was an electoral, well, there's always an electoral pressure, but this was a clear kind of, if they didn't have elected mayors and governors in Japan, one might not have had this kind of dynamic of the government stepping up, environmental regulation, stepping up on redistribution through welfare, social welfare. Okay? And by 1973, always talks about this is year one of welfare. We're going to really focus on welfare. We can't just spread money to protect the farmers in the rural areas or support big business. We have to worry about urban people in urban areas and people who need government help. So, very conservative party has now transformed itself to becoming a very broad, almost socialist positions on welfare. So, it's a transformation, a very successful transformation, and this allowed the LDP to stay in power without creating too much, without allowing this frustration to boil into government change. So overall, we could argue that it was a de-idealization and focus on material growth. And the LDP became a very non-ideological party, pragmatic. Pragmatic is practical. Whatever works, whatever makes them win the next election, they'll do it. And so they won't be focused on a particular ideology or ideological goal. All these groups, as I said, were embraced. This is just different pictures from the period. 1964, I think, is the year that the Shinkansen started as a symbol of redistributing wealth and focusing on growth ever more. People are traveling more, overseas travel, starting to shoot it up. This is Ikeda Hayato, the prime minister, who said, I'm going to double your income. Now, doubling income sounds like magic, sounds like a miracle today. If prime minister came and said, we're going to double your income, I think he's crazy. But it was not such a crazy thing to say in 1960. Why? Well, if you have 10% growth every year, if you compound 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, after 10 years, it's not doubling income, it's not a big, it's realizable, right? But it sounds very dramatic. I'm going to double your income. Never heard of folks who say that. But anyway, that sucked out the energy from all the protest movements. Okay, we've already talked about that. And, well, we should go back to what's the opposition doing, at least at the national political level. That is, what is the Socialist Party doing? Well, they're continuing to complain about the Constitution or about the Security Treaty, about the Cold War. They're continually focusing on Article 9 issues, and they're divided. Right? They are sort of shrill. This was how they were described in the book: shrill, ideological, and inflexible. They're unable to have a wide support base. They only have support from their unions and very ideological pacifists. They cannot expand their support because they're ideological and inflexible. And there's a lot of ideological infighting between the socialists too, within the socialist leadership. And this leads to splits within the party. The JSP splits into DSP, branches off, the Minshato branches off from the Shakaito. This makes them weaker. A new party in the urban area called Kometo starts in the mid-60s. These are essentially founded by a religious organization, and most of the voters, supporters for this party are from a religious Buddhist lay organization called Soka-Gakkai. But they get a lot of support from urban housewives and urban workers. This is a very, very rich place for votes if you're a socialist party. Urban housewives, dissatisfied, lower income family groups, But no, that voting bloc was taken away by a new party. They couldn't unite. They couldn't manage to make a left coalition, a grand coalition. Sometimes at the local level, for governor election, mayor election, they managed alliance, but it couldn't translate to the national level, which is very unfortunate. Okay, and finally, LDP wins election. If you win an election, you control government, you control the budget, you control how money is spent, right? You redistribute, you have very good relationship with the bureaucracy, or you create relations with the bureaucracy. You create strong relationship with business who donates political donations to you. If you repeat that 2 elections, 3 elections, 4 elections, it becomes a very strong bond. And it becomes very difficult for the opposition to break in. The more you're away from power, the further it gets. The only thing you have to do perhaps is to wait until the party in power collapses on its own by making mistakes. But they managed to avoid the mistakes, major mistakes. They managed to correct their position quite effectively. Why could the LDP do that? Different things you can argue about, but there are fortunate circumstances and probably very effective self-regulating mechanisms within the party. How about the student movement? Well, I don't have too much time to talk about it, but just one thing to note is that in all these protests against the security treaty, in the Miyake coal mines, in the environmental protests, in the Narita protests, students were very much involved, very much opposed, basically, to the government's positions. There were a lot of pacifists, socialists, those supporting workers. The elite students were very much involved. This is not just in Japan. 1960s in European countries, Paris Spring in 1968. There are all these student movements. And in the beginning, they were very successful, right? Zengakuren enrolled all students as members. If you were a student, you were automatically a part of this All Japan Federation of Student Self-Governing Associations, Zengakuren. The leadership was dominated by the JCP, but then different kinds of groups and ideologies started to take over. And they're very active in all these different groups. They're also very active in the 60s, end of the 60s, in which they protested against various things in the university. For example, increasing tuition. I mean, I'm sure tuition, I don't know how much tuition was increased at that time, but compared to today, I'm sure tuition in public universities is very, very low. But they also demanded changing the curriculum, the content, changing the way lectures were done, democratizing the classroom. Why is the professor just standing there and talking to us and lecturing us? It's just a factory for capitalism to create obedient workers for capitalism, and we don't want that. We want to change it. We want a revolution in our classrooms, greater role and autonomy in university governance. These are all kinds of things pushed, not just in Todai or Nichidai, but across all these universities, Keio, Waseda as well. Okay, but eventually it became more and more violent, and it became more and more factionalized. All these sects appeared. I'm kind of jumping to this extreme end, but this is what happened. There's so much, the protests became more and more violent and internal. They're fighting each other. This very funny picture, not funny, but all these helmets they wear, they're different design and logo. They're all different kinds of groups, Marxist or anarchist, Communist International, Vietnam Peace Alliance, Red Army, Hante Gakkyo, or something scary. Anyway, all these groups, and they're fighting each other all the time. For, which one is more ideologically pure, which one has sold itself out, probably. And it became so bad, not only were they protesting, they took over universities, that is, they barricaded universities, they occupied the universities. So campuses had to be closed in 1969 spring. Classes could not be conducted. Sometimes they even went into the professors' rooms and took over the professors' research rooms. Famous story of one of these professors, political science professors in Todai, and came to his office and there are these students sitting there, and he had to explain himself to these students, sort of like red guards. Also infighting violence, which reduces public support. 1960s, the students were very much together with the union workers, and feminists and environmental groups. They're very much linked. But by 1969, it had become too extreme, too much fighting, too isolated. So they had lost support. And so they were also crushed by public authority because they didn't have public support. This is just a nice picture to end with. This is Kyoto University, 1968, I guess. And this is Todai. That's the cool. So it looked like this back then. You can see these takegaman. This is a tradition, I guess, that continues burning. So that's it. Sorry we ended with this scary picture. Just as an image that this sort of thing happens in Japan. Right? Of course, these student protesters, they have continued on, I guess, and there's still some of them here in Kyoto. Old timers, maybe not from 1960s, but they're Nisei and Sansei. I don't know, maybe some of you are involved in that, which is fine. But I think just as a gap, this was a period when most of these university students, they will find jobs, because the unemployment was so low and companies are expanding and opportunities expanding that you leave university, you're insured some kind of job. And your parents are getting wealthier. But today, it's the opposite situation. It's very severe, right? Employment. Maybe not for Kyodai students, I don't know, but it's not as easy as in the 60s. And here they have life ahead of them. Very, very, not easy sailing, but relatively easy sailing. And they're protesting violently. And then now the students here, they have so much to fight against, perhaps, but there's very little struggle or conflict. So, I don't know. The contrast is very interesting to me. So that was the lecture. I'm sorry, it was kind of long-winding. We have 8 minutes. If you have any questions first, I'm sorry it was rambling lecture, but there's a lot to cover. Now you get a general idea of how different it was back then in terms of the level of tension and conflict in the different groups that were fighting it out and how it was resolved and how LP managed to override these challenges quite effectively by compensation. Does anybody have any questions? No? Is this all old stuff for you? Everybody has heard about this in your high school textbook? Más o menos? More or less. Okay, well, if you have no questions, shall I go to discussion or shall we just close for the day? Is everybody understanding what I'm saying? Please raise your hand if it was too fast. Yeah, it was a bit too much now. I'll try and be a bit more. I was saying this and this and this and this, but it's good. You listen to a lecture like this sometimes, so I'll try and be a bit more focused next week. Oh, actually, next week we don't have any classes. I'm going to be away, so it's Q-Ko. Okay? Q-Ko means no class. We will reschedule for May in July. We'll have regular class on May 24th, but May 17th, no class. Everybody understood? So don't come here next week. You still have homework though. You have to read chapter 16. Okay? Please read chapter 16. We'll talk a little bit about Japan in the world. Now we've been focusing on domestic, and we'll do a bit more of Japan in the world, and then we'll move on to the modern period. So it'll be a bit more immediate for you. Okay? Now, who has my textbook? Who has borrowed a copy of my textbook? Please come up and return it. If you want to borrow the textbook, I have probably 4 copies. Anybody can come up. It's first come, first serve. Okay? That's yours. So if you want to borrow, come up. If you have borrowed it 2 weeks ago, please bring it back. And there's always a possibility of a pop quiz. So don't forget, we have 3 pop quizzes and then a final written paper. No final exam. It says in the syllabus final exam, but final written paper. Okay?
Are these pop quizzes related to the day's course, or is it at the end of the course?
Sorry, I will do it in the beginning of the class, and it will be up to all the things that I spoke about. So all the previous classes and the day's class. So all the assignments up to them. So if there's a pop quiz from 2 weeks from now, it'll be including the topics that we talked until now, and also the topic that I'll talk about on that week. That is the reading, chapter 16. Okay? There's a very, very high likelihood of a pop quiz. But don't tell your friends that didn't come here, because then you missed out. You can be nice and tell them. But. Okay, come and pick up this if you want. Those of you who won't, bring it back. See you next week.